Thanks so much for having me. It's actually been a great week. This is the first week where I've spoken on a college campus and really didn't fear being killed, actually. So that's exciting. So, number one, thanks to Young America's Foundation for having me. Thanks to Fred R. Allen for sponsoring this lecture series. And thanks to all of you for showing up and for the people who did the organizing to make sure that people knew about the event. And I'm looking forward to a solid discussion, especially with the people who showed up. I hope some people showed up who disagree. That's what makes it fun and interesting. And if you decide to disrupt, then it just makes you a jerk. So, today we're going to talk about all of the dumb, nonsensical, stupid, hot-button terms that your professors like to use, your administrators like to use, and some of your fellow students like to use to shut down debate and stifle opposition and ensure that we can't actually have good, productive conversations with one another. This is what the left has been doing since the 1960s and the 1970s. Nothing really has changed except that the people who took over the buildings in the 1960s and 1970s now occupy those buildings as a form of their job, and their ideological grandchildren are seeking to get them fired for no apparent reason. So today what we're going to do is we're going to go through and debunk five particular terms that you've heard a lot and that you will hear a lot more, I'm sure. Diversity, white privilege, trigger warnings, microaggressions, and safe spaces. We'll go through all of these individually because if you're not tired of hearing about them by now, then hopefully you will be by the time I'm done. So, this, just preface, some people might get upset by this. That's okay, because fortunately I don't care. Facts tend to upset people because facts contradict their worldview. But again, as I like to say, facts don't really care about your feelings. So let's start. Okay, diversity. Let's start with diversity. So the left is obsessed with diversity. When I spoke at Cal State Los Angeles just a few months ago, and there was a near riot, it was actually only about a month ago now, that I spoke there, and there was as close to a riot as I've ever been close to. A few days before I was scheduled to speak, the reason things went sideways is because the president of the university, a guy named William Covino, he put out a notice saying that I couldn't come speak anymore. He canceled the speech, and what he wrote was this. He said, quote, "After careful consideration, I have decided that it will be best for our campus community if we reschedule Ben Shapiro's appearance for a later date, so that we can arrange for him to appear as part of a group of speakers with differing viewpoints on diversity. Such an event will better represent our university's dedication to the free exchange of ideas and the value of considering multiple viewpoints." So in non-gobbledygook stupid talk, what that means is they didn't like my perspective, so in the name of diversity, they were going to shut down my perspective. There was no future date set. I was the diversity. I mean, there was nobody else on campus remotely approaching my political perspective. And this is what the left means by diversity. What the left means by diversity is you don't get to talk if you disagree with us. If this seems somewhat Orwellian, that's because it is somewhat Orwellian. This is always what they mean by tolerance, too. When they say tolerance, what they mean is tolerance of the things with which we agree, and no tolerance for the things with which we disagree. And this, again, goes back to the 1960s, when philosophers like Herbert Marcuse were taking over campuses. We're all too young, presumably, to know who Herbert Marcuse was, but if you've ever heard the slogan, "Make love, not war," that was his idiotic idea. And one of the things that he pushed was the idea of liberating tolerance. He said there were two types of tolerance. There was repressive tolerance. Repressive tolerance was freedom. Repressive tolerance was free speech. Because you see, the people who are downtrodden and oppressed in American society, we can't trust them with free speech. Free speech is just a way to give them the feeling that they're free without actually making them free. True freedom comes from material equality, and the only way to achieve that is to shut down the right. So what he said we need is not repressive tolerance, freedom. What we need instead is what he called liberating tolerance, which he said would mean intolerance, this is a direct quote, intolerance against movements from the right and tolerance of movements from the left. This is the way the left treats diversity of thought, and this is nasty. This is not diversity, of course. The only kind of diversity they really care about is diversity of skin color. That's the only thing the left really cares about is diversity of skin color. But as anybody who's moral and decent knows, skin color really shouldn't matter. Skin color should be irrelevant. You being a good person should be relevant. Your skin color shouldn't be relevant. Values matter, skin color doesn't, and if you disagree, you're a racist. But the left, unfortunately, is racist. Skin color matters significantly more than being a decent person or than making good decisions in life. What underlies this? Why is it that Martin Luther King's vision of what the United States and society was supposed to be about, the idea that we judge you based on the content of your character rather than the color of your skin, what made that disappear in favor of early brand Malcolm X, like pre-awakening Malcolm X? What is it that made people revert to that? What made people revert to this sort of vile idea that people are to be defined by their race and by their identity group? What stands behind that is the left's belief in one principle above all. fairness. Not fairness of opportunity, not fair shot, not a fair shake, as President Obama likes to say. Fairness of outcome, equality of outcome. So if you talk to somebody who's on the left, and the only information you give them about a situation is that there are two people in a room, one of them has $5 in his pocket and the other one has $1 in his pocket, the leftist will tell you that this is unfair. Something unfair has happened because one person has $5 and one person has $1. This is also a 2-year-old version of fairness. I have a 2-year-old. This is her version of fairness. Okay, the problem with this, of course, is that it suggests that the person with $5 must have done something deeply wrong in order to have the $5, and the person with $1 must have been victimized in some way, and that's why the person has $1. And so we have to fix that. And the way that you fix that is through force, essentially. The left believes that the freedom and liberty of the United States, diversity of thought, the philosophy of individualism and individual responsibility, that is, in effect, racist. It's in effect racist because if you have group identities, if you have a group of folks, if you have black folks, for example, who are earning less on average than white folks in the United States, that must be a result of white privilege, right? That must be a result of this ghost in the machine, this institutional racism. We don't know what it is, but it's out there. That must be causing it. It can't be attributable to individual decisions. It can't be attributable to you making a decision how to act in your life. It has to be something else that's just out there in the ether, this white privilege. You blame the person next to you for the fact that you have $1 in your pocket. So the system has to be torn down. The system must be to blame. Right? The system that's been created by these evil white people for the benefit of other evil white people. And this is a very seductive and nice idea for a lot of folks. It's a seductive idea for minorities and for white leftists. It's a seductive idea if you're a minority because you're automatically granted victimhood status, which is highly sought after. You're a better person. You're virtuous if you're a victim in American society. And it also gives you the ability to declare that your own failure is actually the result of somebody else. I mean, we all like that. It's just a human nature thing. This is not a racial thing. It's a human nature thing. If I have the decision whether to attribute my own failings to my own activity or attribute it to some shadowy force that everybody is going to believe, then I'm going to attribute it to the shadowy force that everybody is going to believe. So if you're a black person and you're failing at your classes, the idea is white institutional privilege must have caused this. If less black people than white people are getting into high-ranking colleges, that can't be because less black people than white people are doing well on the SATs, or they're getting poorer educations, or they come from worse family structures. It has to be because there are white people who are in positions of power who are preventing this from occurring. The same thing holds true if you are gay or Hispanic, if you're a woman, even though women are a majority of Americans. It doesn't matter. The bottom line is that so long as you are not a white heterosexual cisgender male, then you get to claim this status. You're a victim of the patriarchy, and you're a victim of white privilege. It's seductive for white people on the left, too, because it allows them to feel like they're broad-minded. It allows them to feel like they're better than they are. It gives them an unearned level of moral superiority. See, I checked my own privilege. That's how I know I'm a good person, is that I checked my own privilege. And I'll admit that everything I do is based on this terrible system of white privilege, and therefore I'm going to help you fight against this system of white privilege. If I just grab the scourge and I whip myself hard enough and shout mea culpa, mea maxima culpa, then I'm admitted into the congregation of the saved. According to the campus left, of course, the only people left are those white heterosexual cisgender males who say, well, wait a second, in the free country like the United States, the vast majority of folks are not victims of some evil system, they're victims of decisions that they make, which is the truth, right? Those are the only people who are left. But those people are bad. We have to castigate them. We have to tell them they just don't get it. It's like the emperor's new clothes. We just have to, everybody has to recognize that the emperor is wearing clothes, and the person who shouts the emperor is not wearing new clothes has to be cudgeled. Because the idea is that the founding fathers, they were a bunch of racists, and they created this evil white system for the perpetuation of the evil white male patriarchy. And therefore, anybody who benefits who's white has benefited because of this system. There's only one problem with this beautiful bedtime story for the left, which is that this is not true. The real reason that some people succeed and some people fail in a free country like the United States is because some people make good decisions and some people make unbelievably crappy decisions. White privilege is not reality. Decision privilege is a reality. Whites are not succeeding because they have a genetic predisposition to making better decisions, and blacks are not succeeding because they have a genetic predisposition to making bad decisions. The problem is that there are certain cultures in the United States, including cultures of self-perpetuating victimology, that suggest that no matter what decision you make, the outcome should always be the same. There is such a thing as privilege, by the way. There is such a thing as actual born-into privilege. Privilege like two-parent privilege is a natural privilege. If you are born into a two-parent household, which is a decision that your parents made. If you're born into a two-parent household, you are significantly more privileged than if you are born into a single-parent household. And this is true across races. Right? The poverty rate in black families with two parents is 7% in the United States. The poverty rate for white families with one parent in the United States, a single mother in the United States, is 22%. What happened to the white privilege? Why aren't the white people doing better even if they have a single mother? The answer is they're not doing better because they have a single mother. Certain decisions have consequences. The single greatest intergenerational predictor of poverty is single motherhood. And let me tell you, white privilege is not responsible for a black guy getting his black girlfriend pregnant and then taking off. That's him just being a jackass. And the same thing is true of any boyfriend of any race who does that. The fact is that your decisions are in your hands, particularly personal decisions, which tend to be the ones that have the most impact on people's lives. Here's another privilege. I like to call it the not committing crimes privilege. It turns out that if you wish to avoid jail, the easiest way to do that is to not be a criminal. The idea of white privilege is that a bunch of random innocent black folks are getting rounded up, innocent Hispanic folks are being rounded up and thrust into jail, but the people who perpetuate the notion of white privilege can't seem to come up with a full list of the innocent people who are in jail that they want to get out to match the supposed disproportionality in prison population. Here's the fact about that supposedly evil justice system. It actually under-prosecutes black crime, particularly black murder. And the fact is that as a percentage, there are more murders by blacks on blacks than there are, as a percentage, murderers in prison who are black. And the reason for that is because the police this actually is an institutional problem. The police actually are not staffed in proper numbers to black communities because there is so much fear of political correctness. What black communities that are high crime need is more cops, not less cops, because you need to catch the criminals. High crime communities need more cops. The cops are the people who are going to help those communities. Get rid of the cops and you end up with exactly the sort of lawlessness that you see in Ferguson or that you see in Baltimore. You pull out the cops and what you get is shambles. When police, by the way, do come into contact with black folks, the idea from the Black Lives Matter movement is that white privilege suggests that when police come into contact with black folks, they disproportionately shoot or brutalize black folks. Statistics do not bear this out. They do not bear this out. Police are less likely to kill black folks in confrontations that are violent with the cops than they are to kill white folks in the same kind of confrontations, according to a study from John Jay College. The guy's name is Professor Peter Moskos. He's at City University of New York. You can look up the study. It's very solidly done. As early as 1994, the Department of Justice surveyed felony cases in the country's largest 75 urban areas, and they found lower felony prosecution rates for blacks than for whites. One of the evidences of white privilege is the stop and frisk program in New York, right? Bill de Blasio, that communist tool, he came in and he got rid of stop and frisk because he thought that this was a terribly racist, white institutional racism privilege nonsense thing. Okay, here's the problem. He's wrong. Stop and frisk supposedly targeted minorities in outsized proportions. It did. It targeted them less than they should have been targeted by percentage. The fact is, from January to June 2008, 98% of all gun assailants, right, and stop and frisk is generally designed to catch people who have guns, because the cops can identify, theoretically, if you're walking with a gun. You're walking differently, you have a bump under your coat. That's what stop and frisk is. 98% of all gun assailants in New York City were black or Hispanic. Stop and frisk in that city under-targeted minorities. Only 85% of the people who were targeted in stop and frisk were black or Hispanic. How about pulling people over for speeding? You hear this one a lot, driving while black. Right? I'm just driving around, I'm a black guy, and the cops pull me over. Listen, I understand why if you're black and the cops pull you over, you may perceive that the cop is bothersome and is pulling you over because you're black. I guarantee you that as a white guy, when the cops pull me over, I'm wildly annoyed. Okay, it turns out some cops are nice and some cops are not, and the cops who have pulled me over historically haven't been particularly nice. But the fact is this: the cops are not statistically overrepresenting with blacks. They're not statistically targeting blacks in outsized numbers. In the early 2000s, there was an accusation that in New Jersey, the cops were pulling over too many black folks. They were targeting black folks for driving while black. And so there was a big federal investigation. The DOJ was brought into it, the New Jersey Attorney General, and here's what they found. They did a survey, and they actually identified, through cameras and surveillance, they identified, without pulling people over, how many people of each particular race were speeding. It turned out that blacks were 25% of all speeders, and they were 23% of the drivers stopped for speeding. It turns out that black folks were just disproportionately speeding. How about sentencing disparities? You hear this one too with white privilege, right? Sentencing disparities. Blacks and whites, if they commit the same crimes, the whites don't go to jail, the blacks do go to jail. This is not true either. Okay, the fact is that as early as 94, as I say, the Justice Department was finding that this was not true. If you get rid of all the confounds, right, if you get rid of the past history of crime, the nature of the crime itself, the additional elements that are added on to the crime, these disparities disappear. And the usual one that's trotted out at this point is the disparity between crack cocaine and powder cocaine sentencing. The reason for that is because crack cocaine is more addictive and more easily available than powder cocaine, and therefore easier to distribute, and which is why it's done more damage than powder cocaine to various communities in the United States. And the original purveyors of the double standard in terms of the sentencing for crack and powder cocaine were black legislators from the inner city who were sick of watching their communities ravaged by drugs. But apparently all of this is white privilege. It's all attributable to white privilege. You know, for example, when Baltimore riots, and we saw this from the media, when Baltimore riots, Baltimore is majority black, the majority of the police force is black, the mayor was black, the chief of police was black, the president was black, the attorney general of the United States was black, and the bulk of the city council was either black or I think it was entirely Democrat. I think it was 9 out of 15 were black. When the city burns down, that's the fault of the white people, right? White privilege. And if we're going to play this all the way through, maybe the people who are really benefiting in American society, the people we really ought to be watching out for, because they're the people screwing everyone else, are those damn Asians. Because those Asians, we're really suffering from serious Asian privilege here in the United States, because it turns out that Asians are about to surpass whites, if they haven't already, as the single highest earning group in the United States. And Asians also get into college, good colleges disproportionately, which is why colleges discriminate against Asians, actually do. And the fact is that Princeton University was finding 10 years ago that when the SATs were still out of 1600, which is back in my day, wasn't that long ago, when they were out of 1600, Princeton University did a study, and what they found is that black folks received a bonus of 230 points on the SATs, and Asians were penalized 50 points. All of that must be because all of that's just and perfect. That's fine, because we live in a country where a bunch of Asian founders got together to design a system specifically for the benefit of all the Asian folks. I mean, there was all that terrible, making the Chinese work as slaves on the railroad and all that. But aside from that, it's been awesome for the Asians all the way through, especially because, as we all know, George Washington spoke Chinese. It turns out there is no such thing as white privilege. White privilege is just a way of shutting down the debate. It's a way of saying I don't have to deal with the actual argument because I can blame a ghost. I can blame a ghost. I'm not a ghostbuster, neither are you. There's no way to fight racism if you are actually just going to cite to broad notions like white privilege. If you actually want to fight racism, find a racist policy, show me that it's a racist policy, and I will stand next to you. If you want to show me a person who's behaving in racist fashion, I will stand next to you and I will protest that person. If you want to show me a legislator who's behaving in racist fashion and passing racist laws, I will vote against that legislator. But don't tell me that out there somewhere in the ether, like the spaghetti monster, don't tell me that there's racism out there that's just attacking people randomly on the street, because it's just not true. The problem is this. If we're all held to the same behavioral standard, and yet some people succeed and some people fail, the left doesn't like that. So they have to come up with a different metric. If they're never going to be able to achieve equality of outcome, they have to come up with a different metric of equality. And that's when we get to equality of feelings. My favorite thing, feelings. So, in order to achieve equality of feelings, there's really only one way to achieve equality of feelings, and that's for nobody to talk ever. If we all just shut up, then we're all equally happy and we're all equally miserable, and nothing you say can upset me and nothing I say can upset you, because we're like a silent monastery and everybody's very happy. And this is what trigger warnings are for, right? We have to make sure that nobody is ever offended. No one should ever be offended. We should all just feel good about ourselves. You should never have to deal with an idea that bothers you. You should never have to deal with a fact that bothers you. We have to issue trigger warnings. So anytime I say anything controversial, I have to give a trigger warning. Now, there's an article earlier this week in the Harvard Crimson, and it was by a student there. He says this: in a class I attended earlier this semester, a large portion of the first meeting was devoted to compiling a list of rules for class discussion. A student contended that as a woman, she would be unable to sit across from a student who declared that he was strongly against abortion, and other students in the seminar vigorously defended this declaration. The professor remained silent because this person needed a trigger warning. Or if a couple years ago Babe Buchanan comes to speak, we need a trigger warning, because who knows? That little old lady might kill someone, right? It's a trigger warning. We wouldn't want anyone triggered, because if you're triggered, your feelings are hurt, you lose your equality of feeling, and then who knows what could happen. You might cry. I mean, that would be the end of the world. But that's not enough. Trigger warnings aren't enough. So what happens if the trigger warnings don't work and I say things that offend you anyway? Well, that's when we get into the territory of microaggressions. Right? Microaggressions are the idea that if you are subjectively, not objectively, if I don't say anything that's objectively offensive, if I just say something that you find offensive, that, I say anything and you just take it bad. You take it the wrong way. That's a microaggression. Right? And the problem with the word microaggression is that it carries in it the seeds of violence. Because the fact is that if you were to come up and, God forbid, try punching me, I would punch you back, right? Aggression is to be met with aggression. The idea of a microaggression is that it's not a word that offends me or something you say that offends me. It's an aggression against me, and now I get to respond with actual aggression. So when I spoke at Cal State Los Angeles, one of the professors there, who was a real bright guy, he actually threatened to, he said that the students who brought me, he wanted to wrestle the students. He actually threatened to wrestle the students. And he also added at the bottom of his Facebook note, "Do you lift, bro?" Really, this was on his face. I can certainly see why he deserves to be part of the professoriate with genius intellectual credentials like this. And then he posted on his wall a sign that said, "The best response to microaggression is macroaggression." And unfortunately, the left feels this way. They feel like if you say something that offends them, they get to react with physical violence. And this has crossed all lines. Now it's if you say he or she, that's a microaggression. If you ask somebody where they're from, that's a microaggression. If you say things that are factual, like single motherhood is a detriment to most communities in terms of crime and poverty, this is a microaggression because somebody is offended by this. And violence is therefore justified. So personal story, just because this is a fun story to tell. I don't know how many of you saw or have seen when I appeared on CNN Headline News on Dr. Drew's show. I'm seeing a few people nodding, so they know it's coming. So for those who don't know, and why would you? Because no one watches Dr. Drew. It's a terrible show. They called me up around the time of the Caitlyn Jenner, the Caitlyn Jenner being given the Heroism Award by ESPN. And at the time, if you recall the media discussion, the only question was whether Caitlyn Jenner ought to receive the Congressional Medal of Honor or whether Caitlyn Jenner ought to be actually sainted if we got a couple of miracles under his belt. And so, my perspective on transgenderism has been very clear for a very long time. I don't believe in magic machines, surgeries, or hormones that make men into women or women into men. I think it's cruel to transgender people to suggest that surgery makes you into the opposite sex. I feel that mental illness deserves serious treatment. It doesn't deserve to be treated as a celebrity photo op. And I find the entire media centering on Caitlyn Jenner and his problems disgusting, and I think the attempt to get rid of gender altogether and pretend it doesn't exist, it's just a figment of your imagination. It's wrong-headed, it's non-biological, it's ascientific, and it's idiotic. So the producers knew all of this, and they brought me in because of all of this, right? I was the only guy in LA who feels this way. So they bring me in to have this conversation on the panel, and it's me versus, I think it was 7 other people on the panel, maybe 6 other people on the panel, which made it almost fair for them. And so I come in and they tell me, the producer says to me that this is going to be he actually says, our ratings have been really bad, and we want to raise the ratings, and that's why we're bringing you on, because we want some controversy. I said, well, fortunately I do that professionally. And so the producer of the program, and this is where I should have known things were going to go poorly, the producer of the program says, and I used to produce for Jerry Springer. And, okay. And so when they seat us, they put us out in the panel. There are 3 people on the panel, and there are 3 people next to me. So I guess it was me versus 6. And one of the people who they put next to me, the guy who they put next to me, was a fellow named Zoe Tur, who is a transgender male to female. Right? Zoe Tur's name used to be Bob Tur, and Bob Tur was actually a reporter. I think he served in the military at one point, and had 3 biological kids. And so Bob Tur, or Zoe Tur rather, is sitting next to me. And this conversation is going on, and people are just trying to determine whether Caitlyn Jenner should be given 1 unicorn or an entire bevy of unicorns. And is he more or less heroic than the people who stormed Normandy Beach to fight the Nazis? The consensus seemed to be more. And finally they come to me, and I say, I don't understand why we as a society are engaging in mass delusion that harms the mentally ill. This did not go over well, and Zoe Tur, who's sitting next to me, says, well, you don't know anything about science. And I said, well, I certainly know something about genetics, and I know that every cell in Caitlyn Jenner's body, with the exception, ironically, of some of Caitlyn Jenner's sperm cells, has Y chromosomes in it. And he says, well, you don't know anything about genetics. And I said, well, what are your genetics, sir? And it was the sir that got him, I think. And honest to God, it was not, honest to God, I did not mean to offend. But when I'm speaking to a man, I call him sir, and when I'm speaking to a woman, I call her ma'am. It's just how I was brought up. So I say sir, and Zoe Tur grabs me by the back of the neck on national TV, and pulls me in a little bit and says, if you don't cut that out, it was either I'll send you home or you'll go home in an ambulance. Which, first of all, makes no sense. Ambulances don't take you home. And then he continued in a voice significantly lower than my own to tell me about how he was a woman. And so as this continues, listen, and here's the point of the story. That's all I'll lead off. The point of the story is this. I say, sir, he grabs me by the back of the neck. He threatens to send me home in an ambulance. Later on, he would threaten to meet me in the parking lot, and then on Twitter, he would threaten to curb stomp me. It was good times all around. And the rest of the panel, and this is sort of the point, the rest of the panel responds not by saying you're not allowed to grab people on national television because that's battery, and when you threaten them, it's assault and battery. Instead, the entire panel turns on me and says, how dare you offend Zoe that way? How dare you offend Zoe that way? So the idea is if you're offensive, then you are to be met with physical violence. Now listen, you can disagree with me, you can think I'm a jackass, you can think whatever you want, but what you don't get to do is engage in acts of physical aggression and violence because you don't like what I'm saying. This is a basic principle of Western civilization, right? But this is going by the wayside because of the microaggression culture. And it's dominant on college campuses now, this idea that if you don't like what somebody is saying, you get to call the cops. I mean, at University of Missouri, they actually had this. When University of Missouri was going through what it was going through, University of Missouri actually had a situation where the police actually put out a public notice. We talked about it at the time. They put out a notice that said, if somebody says something that offends you, here's the number for the police. Okay, this is the essence of fascism. I'm offended, I don't like what you're saying, I'm calling the big men with the guns. Right? That is the essence of fascism. And that's taking over college campuses, and it is anti-American. Once you've gotten all the trigger warnings and the microaggressions out of the way, you've threatened everybody, you've called in the cops, finally you have achieved a safe space, which is to say a fascist space. Because it turns out the only safe spaces, when it comes to the way the left describes safe spaces, the only safe spaces are unfree spaces, spaces where we can't have discussions together. Because right now, listen, I'm saying things I'm sure that offend at least 1/3 to 1/2 of the people who are listening. Guess what? We're all safe, because this is America. America's an actual safe space. But in order to create a lefty safe space, we have to ban people who disagree. Sometimes we have to segregate people. At University of Missouri, when there were all the protests that were making national news, the black students insisted that white students not be allowed to come into their safe space, even if they were coming because they agreed with the black students. To which the KKK said, yeah, that's awesome. Separate but equal. Awesome. All for it. It turns out that when you're trying to create a fascist safe space, it's not good for anybody, including the people who are trying to create that fascist safe space. And here's the problem with all of this. When you put it all together, the white privilege and the microaggressions and the trigger warnings and the false diversity of thought, when you put all of these things together into one ball, what you end up with is a recipe for making people insane. Really, making people crazy. You're telling them it's good to be easily offended. You're telling them it's good to lash out against people who offend them. You're telling them they are more and the more offended they are, the more they go up in the hierarchy of victimhood and therefore in the hierarchy of virtue. Jonathan Haidt is a psychologist at New York University, and he says this. He says, the recent collegiate trend, is in the Atlantic, the recent collegiate trend of uncovering allegedly racist, sexist, classist, or otherwise discriminatory microaggressions doesn't incidentally teach students to focus on small or accidental slights. Its purpose is to get students to focus on them and then relabel the people who have made such remarks as aggressors. And the idea is once you've labeled somebody an aggressor, then you can target them and you can hurt them. It's also the opposite, by the way, of what the psych majors in the room know is cognitive behavioral therapy, which is if you're going to have a pattern of thoughts that lead you to a bad place, the psychologist is supposed to help you break down that pattern and say, instead of giving you a trigger warning, we're going to explain where is your thought process going wrong so you end up in a bad place. Instead of college students being taught to think like that so that when they're in the real world and they encounter something they don't like, they can deal with it, instead they're being taught, be as offended as possible, yell as loudly about it as you can, try and shut the person who's talking up, go to the administration, complain about it, and have them shut down.